What's up, future shred lords? Welcome back. Death of the Fingers. I'm often asked about the high order thinking skills you need to be an effective musician. So we're going to go over today. These are the secrets of the uber guitarist, because effectively, when you master these basic principles and start applying them to your practice sessions, you go from being pretty good to being highly effective and having a lot more options in terms of what you can play and how you put the stuff together, which makes your playing a lot more exciting. So, no more yip yapping in the intro. Let's get into this bad boy. All right, this first section here is on multiplicity. Obviously, when I move to a position of the major scale, or any scale for that matter, I have an absolute ridiculous number of options to draw from. So this idea of multiplicity is very important because it allows you, I guess, the luxury of now being like, what sound is it that I'm looking for now that I'm all the way down here in the Ionian position? And so mastering this sort of skill, if you will, where you start to catalog these sounds and mess with them in the context of a jam or when you're just practicing and whatnot is going to be incredibly important, because you're like, I can keep building up this catalog of information based around this one spot. And you'll see me go through a whole bunch of them here in the example. So multiplicity is incredibly important. A lot of people think, oh, it's just one or two scales. As you'll see, there's a whole lot more than that. So let's get into it. All right, next up here is synergy. Obviously, you've heard me talk about this quite a bit. Essentially, two elements that complement each other in a very musically pleasing way. So in the first example, I do a perfect cadence, 5-1, if you will. So I go from D7 to G major. And then in the next one, you hear me use essentially the E harmonic minor scale resolving to the G major modes, if you will. And then the last one is I'm using a sequence of minor 7 to dominant 7 arpeggios. And again, you can really hear this concept of synergy. And that's what you're looking for. It's not the sequence in and of itself. It's this idea that you're always constantly on the hunt for like this element and this element, they go well together. So you're constantly looking at sort of putting them together. You're like minor 7 and dominant 7. Those two huge categories, they go well together. So find every possible combination that you can of minor 7 to dominant 7. And when you start doing stuff like that, all of a sudden you open a whole lot of doors and you have a lot more sort of material to play with because you're not restricted anymore. Okay, so synergy, the idea that these two things, they play really well together and they almost sort of set each other up, as you'll hear in the example. Let's do it. All right, next up here is essentially flow. Once you get onto synergy, you're like, okay, these two elements, they go well together. You can start chaining, those groups of two, if you will, together to create much longer sequences, which has flow. So you have to start to practice things where you sort of go from one state to another. So you'll hear me go from major 7 to dominant 7. It's 1 3 5 7 for the interval structure to 1 3 5 flat 7. And then the next one I do is a minor 7, which is 1 flat 3 5 flat 7. If you notice, I'm starting to diminish one of those chord intervals with each arpeggio sequence. And then of course I diminish the 5th for the minor 7 flat 5. And then I get into fully diminished where I double flat the 7. So you can hear me basically play, I think it's about 6 arpeggios just from the 3rd fret, all based around the Ionian position, if you will, of G major, right? But I'm trying to create this idea of flow between these arpeggios. So this is an exercise you gotta mess around with on your own and be like, okay, I'm gonna start off with this one and then be like, what's the next one that I could play that would cause it to shift enough to make me get that sense of flow, and then just keep moving down the fretboard or up the fretboard, whichever direction you happen to be working in, and really start to work on attenuating your ear to be able to be like each one of these steps. And trust me, it takes a long time. That's why I'm saying start off slowly and start to ramp up. You don't need to play the really hard one. What you need to do is start to think about the idea of like all these sort of synergetic chains linked together create an overall flow for my music. If your flow is good, then people will be like, yeah. And if it's not so good, then people will talk during your set. And if it's bad, people will just leave. And that's basically how that goes. So check out this arpeggio sequence. I think I do about 8 or 9 of them. And I think you'll start to understand that the idea of flow is incredibly important. Now I'm doing it in one position here, but of course you can start spreading this out all over the fretboard. So you do you. Let's get into it. All right, next up is the idea of musicality. I've started to mess with the idea of synergy. So I've got 2 elements, or say like 4 or 5 elements now that I want to start to chain together to create a flow. Right, well, I need to use musicality, ordering these elements so that it comes out with the appropriate flow so people are like, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, otherwise you start interrupting it and you get like into a rapid situation where it's really choppy and people are like, yeah, not so much, right? It's supposed to be as smooth as humanly possible if you can. Sometimes you do want to do a big drop, but that's on purpose and not just because you don't know what you're doing, right? Let's be real. So musicality here, I'm starting off, I have like these elements like the minor 7 and dominant 7. I'm using the harmonic minor scale. I'm using a minor 9 chord, and I'm also using a minor 7 chord. And then finally, the 1 chord, D major, right? So I'm working in the key of B minor. I start off with B minor 6 in this case, and then I use a B minor 7 into a dominant arpeggio, what I call a compound arpeggio. And you'll hear these 2 elements, they synergize well together. It's got a cool sound. It's different. And then, of course, that lets me jump off into the harmonic minor. Using the harmonic minor, that lets me wrap it back up and use the minor 9 chord to resolve the tension of that scale. And of course, it allows me to now jump all the way down to play another B minor or B minor 7 in this case. And finally, resolve using a 6/1 cadence down to the D major. Okay, so you'll hear me take all of those music elements and put them together in a sequence that creates flow, and then use musicality, if you will, to sort of put the cherry on top. So this is stuff you got to practice. You're like, I have all of this stuff. I'm working in the Aeolian position. make something musical, but that isn't predictable. It's not just a pentatonic scale or a couple other scales. You're actually starting to mix and match different ideas. Let's get into the example. All right, last on the list here is interoperability. You have synergy of sounds, but you also have synergy of technique, and that's what interoperability effectively encapsulates. So the Dominus 7 arpeggio system and the Gambale arpeggio system, they have interoperability. So I start putting them together. I again move to the Dorian position. I'm like, look, from last week's lesson, I can go from this Dorian position using the minor 7 up into the Gambale here. In the Lydian position, I'm like, why not do the same thing but go down, which gives me a minor 7. So that's what you'll hear me start with the minor 7 and then jump up to the major 7 before ending in another minor 7. And then, of course, I exercise some musicality by moving from the 2 chord, the Dorian position of G major, and then flipping it over to be now considered a 6 chord, which makes it C major. And of course, C major being the 4 chord of G major, synergy again. So I jump down and I get this cool cadence. So again, you have synergy of sounds and you have synergy of techniques. And so interoperability is a big one for when you're sitting there, you're starting to break down these more technical passages, and you start to really think about how you can combine these systems to be like, well, these two definitely don't work. But these two work great, and then you can start practicing them as such. So let's get into the example. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope this helps to a certain degree. And remember, just start small. Start with 1 or 2 of these elements like synergy and multiplicity, and you'll be off to the races. And I guarantee you, just start adding something new to the mix every time. Then it's musicality, then it's flow, and finally it's going to be interoperability. Dunsky. We'll see you in the next one.